Hi, welcome to another episode of the Carolyn Glick Middle East News Hour with my co-host Gadi Taub. I'm talking to you today from my mom's house in Chicago, where we finally have been reunited with her after a year and a half of Corona. And so we'll be in the United States for the next month, and we're going to be trying to do these shows transatlantically. And let's see whether Gadi is here. Hey, Gadi, you there?
I am still in Tel Aviv, as I have been since the beginning of the Corona pandemic, Caroline. I have not.
Okay.
Well, I've been to Jerusalem a few times.
Oh, well, that counts.
And I've been to Efrat once, to your house in Efrat.
That's right. That's definitely international travel, particularly leaving Tel Aviv and going anywhere else in Israel is international travel. I've come to the conclusion that,
of course, there is the Ben and Jerry's legitimate territory and the Ben and Jerry's forbidden territory where you live.
Hey, how did you know that was going to be the first topic of our discussion today? Maybe we didn't actually discuss this beforehand, guys. This is all unprepared. But yes, indeed, today on the Middle East News Hour, we're going to be talking about
ice cream.
Ben and Jerry's ice cream. We're talking about our favorite flavor. What did somebody send me? It was
BLM.
Self-hating juice. All right, yum yum. And then we're going to be talking about Gadi is in the center of a firestorm in Israel because he printed an article in Haaretz that tells the truth about Netanyahu's trial, and we're going to get to that shortly. And he's going to have to give us all the details, but he's now in the eye of the storm, right, Gadi? I'm
Luckily, I love this. Just get me into a proper fight, and my adrenaline flows.
Right. So his adrenaline is flowing. So we're going to start real quick. And then we're going to turn to Iran and the nationwide uprising that the Biden administration is doing everything in its power not to mention as it gives away the story to the ayatollahs. But we'll talk about that last. So stay tuned. We've got a full show. Let's start with the ice cream truck. Hey, Gadi, what's going on there? I left the day before yesterday and all hell's broken out.
All hell broke loose in the kitchen. The Ben and Jerry's have decided to boycott Judea and Samaria, where, as our listeners probably know, it is the jurisdiction of what do you call it? You don't say kibush in you don't say occupation.
These are disputed territories to which Israel has legitimate national and legal rights under international law. You should read my book, The Israeli Solution, to get the whole lowdown on the legal status of this.
Now you're saying this, Carol. It's the first episode where it's not right behind you on the shelf.
Right, exactly. I'm going to have to pull it down from my mother's bookshelf somewhere. I know she has about 5 copies, so I'll be able to use one.
And so Ben and Jerry's are busy virtue signaling. And they probably think that would ingratiate them with the right kind of crowds. I fear that, there's a growing rift between the upper echelons of the elites and corporate wokeness who believe that Americans have bought this. If I can say in parentheses, I interviewed Ilana Heron-Fishman, we should do it here on our podcast too, who started a grassroots organization of parents called No Left Turn in Education, who are resisting, critical race theory and gender fluidity theory imposed on their children. And I asked Ilana, half the country or half the electorate voted Democrat. What do you say? Who supports this trend in education? How many people are with you, and how many people are with them? And she said they have maybe 10% of the parents. So Ben and Jerry's have done what I hope would be a costly move for them economically. And they're trying to virtue signal by boycotting the disputed territories, Judea and Samaria, which is
and Jerusalem. Don't forget, it's not just Judea and Samaria. It's also eastern, northern, and southern Jerusalem, all the neighborhoods inside of Jerusalem that Israel reasserted its control over in the 1967
What's the ice cream position on the Golan Heights? Is there one?
I'm not sure. I think it depends, but they'll probably
only the vanilla is forbidden.
But just to be serious, guys, until Trump recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, all of the areas that were being targeted by the BDS movement, the campaigns against us, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions, included as well the Golan Heights. Now, we're not so sure because we don't know what the status is from the American perspective. But I'm sure that since they also want to boycott you in Tel Aviv, Gadi, they probably also mean the Golan Heights.
I have to confess, Caroline, that I once boycotted where you live. I once refused to go across the Green Line before I understood what was what, when I was young and had a skewed vision of what yeah, well, I wanted to say that in a more soft way, but you're right, basically. So people started saying, okay, so like patriots here said, okay, we stopped buying Ben & Jerry's ice cream. Enough. We don't want ice cream. Some leftist idiots did a Twitter survey asking, what do you prefer, ice cream or settlements? Wow, settlements, 68%. You shouldn't have done it. But then the plot thickens, because apparently the franchise, the Israeli franchise of, or the import, I don't know what you call it, the licensed import of Ben & Jerry's.
It's a franchise. No, it's a franchise.
It's a franchise. He refuses to boycott the territories. So now people are saying, don't stop buying Ben & Jerry's if you want to support this guy who's bravely going against his parent company. So now we are eating Ben & Jerry's in order to undermine them. This is a complicated Jewish concept, but we feel we're in the right.
It's true, but that's also important because this isn't the first time that Ben & Jerry's have announced that they're joining the BDS movement and that they're going to stop selling their ice cream at the pizzeria neighborhood, at my neighborhood pizzeria where they sell it. They did it a few years ago. I don't remember when. I was going to check it, but I didn't have time. So you look it up, Ben & Jerry's BDS, and you'll find the time. I think it was around, it was probably around Protective Edge in 2014, the Israel-Hamas war. At any rate, they already joined the BDS movement. This is the second iteration. And back then as well, the owner of the franchise in Israel said, look, we're not boycotting anybody. This is total lie. We're not doing anything. It's all a lie. We're an independent business. We just bought the label. The ice cream is actually made in Beer-Tuvia in southern Israel, not beyond the 1949 armistice lines. I actually think you should move the factory to Judea and Samaria just to really, screw them. But, these are Israeli employees who are making the ice cream in Israel. So he said at the time, don't boycott me. I'm not going to do anything. And sure enough, you can buy Ben & Jerry's all over Judea and Samaria to this day. But he said the same thing now. And I think his franchise license ends in a year and a half. And if he's smart, and it certainly seems that he's a good man, he'll find another label to operate under, and he'll be able to keep his employees and continue his ice cream business all over Israel, because we would be more than happy to stop buying Ben & Jerry's. I don't actually buy it because of the first time around, but we get it free with if we buy 2 pies. So, anyway, but you should boycott Ben & Jerry's. And actually, if you own stocks in their parent company, Unilever, you should start writing letters to the CEO of Unilever and demanding that you'll either sell your stock or that you're gonna or that they have to come down very hard on Ben & Jerry's and say that they're not going to participate in anti-Semitic boycott campaigns anymore. So I think, American consumers in particular of Ben & Jerry's, I know that Dov Hikind, former New York City Assemblyman, had a member of Congress from New York on his webcast the other day. I just linked to it on my Twitter account. And she said, I forget her name, that this is completely unacceptable. Even the communist mayor of New York City, Bill de Blasio, Comrade Bill, said that he was going to boycott Ben & Jerry's. So I think it's much more important for the consumer boycott to happen in the United States. I know that in New Jersey, the rabbinate there is considering removing the hechsher for Ben & Jerry's ice cream. So they may end up losing their ability to sell to the Jewish market in the United States. It would be fantastic.
And
so
I understand
think that
their stocks have gone down because they're in many American states there are anti-BDS laws, and so this may. So the markets are already sensing that this is not going to be a wise move economically, and let's hope it hurts. Before we end on this topic, Caroline, I wanted to add something because I just posted a video by Bassam Id, the Palestinian human rights activist, who's really a brave man because he reports on abuses by the Palestinian Authority.
It's actually important to make a distinction because most people who call themselves human rights activists are actually just anti-Israel, anti-American.
Yeah. I was going to say this. What was?
I'm
happened?
sorry. I shouldn't have interrupted. Never mind.
What Bassem did is he was a member of B'Tselem, which is a major anti-Israeli propaganda organ masquerading as a human rights organization, and he started reporting on abuses by the Palestinian Authority. And they kicked him out. I mean, he left because they wouldn't publish his findings unless they incriminate Israel. They're not interesting. So right. I just posted this interview with him. Maybe we can put a link under our video for that, because he said, who gets hurt by the BDS? The Palestinian population. And he gave the example of SodaStream. SodaStream, an Israeli company, had a manufacturing plant in the territories, was boycotted by the BDS movement. That ended up forcing SodaStream to shift its operation into Israel. Thereby, 1,500 Palestinians lost their jobs. So this whole BDS movement is a Western thing. It's an anti-Israeli thing. It's not even a pro-Palestinian thing. It's just and this is the continuing, how would I call it, sickness of the Palestinian national movement and its auxiliaries, is that they are willing to sacrifice ordinary Palestinians if they can hurt Israelis. You probably know Golda Meir's famous saying that we will only have peace when Arabs love their kids more than they hate us. So the BDS is
I want to also. I wrote about the anti-Semitism in the United States and the failure of the Jewish community to be able to stand up to it. For my column that'll be coming out on Friday this week. But there was an important article that came out on Mosaic magazine this week that our readers should really take a look at, which was written by Joshua Moravchik, about the struggle to define anti-Semitism and how the progressives are trying to water it down, the definition of it, in order to enable them to continue to engage in anti-Semitic activities. So in 2016, and this was after what happened, let me just back up. The reason why this is important is because it puts the Ben and Jerry's thing into context. And I think that that's really important. I'm sure a lot of you remember that a week before 9/11, there was a conference against racism in Durban, South Africa. It was supposed to be the launching pad, or many people thought of it as a launching pad from the home of the apartheid regime, of the new reinvigorated anti-racist campaign for the 21st century. And what it ended up becoming was a completely different thing. It was an anti-Semitic conference. The goal ended up being to transfer the yoke of apartheid and the demonization that the South African regime underwent by the international community, because it was a racist regime by its very nature, and they wanted to transfer that to Israel and transform Israel into the new South Africa, the new apartheid South Africa. And the most important conference there wasn't the conference of the governments that Israel and the United States ended up walking out of, because they tried to define Israel as an apartheid state there. They ended up failing after the Bush administration and the Sharon government left. It was actually the NGO conference. And that conference was spearheaded and organized by Amnesty International, a human rights organization, and Human Rights Watch, which now is just an all-out anti-Semitic pressure group, and a bunch of others with the participation of Israeli, Arab NGOs, Palestinian NGOs. And they put together this plan, the blueprint of everything that we have been suffering for the past 21 years was really set out, or 20 years was set out at the Durban conference. Irwin Cotler, the former Canadian Minister of Justice, was just speaking at an online conference with NGO Monitor, marking the 20th anniversary of the Durban Accords. And he said that if 9/11 was the Kristallnacht of terrorism, the Durban Conference was its Mein Kampf. That was really where they set out the ideology of the political war against the Jews and through us of the international community of the free world. And so that was where they launched the boycott movement against Israel. The concept was to turn Israel into a pariah state, its supporters into pariahs. American Jews, Western Jews should be hounded for their support of Israel to the point where they won't talk about it anymore, and so on and so forth. So the Jewish international response and the response of like-minded people who oppose anti-Semitism became, in 2016, what was adopted as the working definition of anti-Semitism by the International Holocaust Scholars Association, IRA. And so what they did was they defined anti-Semitism, and this was, very left-wing, the organization was, but they defined anti-Semitism and then they gave examples of contemporary anti-Semitism. And among the examples was saying that Israel doesn't have a right to exist, that anti-Zionism is not, that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, that Israel is a Nazi state, that Israel is inherently racist. So all of the things that these people do, as a matter of course, that Ben and Jerry's are doing now with their BDS and claiming that there's something inherently evil about Israel, that it alone should be boycotted, really is a consequence of what happened at Durban 20 years ago. And so then these operations, it was the adoption of the IRA a definition of anti-Semitism was then adopted, or the IRA definition was adopted by around 30 countries, including all these EU member nations, was adopted by the Conservative Party in Britain. And at that time, Jeremy Corbyn was the head of the Labour Party. And he is an anti-Semite, and he supports terrorism against Israel. He calls Israel a Nazi state. He says Israel doesn't have the right to exist. He and all of his ilk and the Momentum movement and all that, they're all anti-Semites. And
he calls Hezbollah and Hamas my friends.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, so he and his friends. So there was after the Conservative Party adopted IRA, there was an expectation that the Labour Party would as well, and he refused, because of the examples that showed that he and all of his comrades are anti-Semites. And that caused a huge
because it's also because they want this lever against Israel. They want to be free to call Israel illegitimate and remain on the side of portraying this as being in favor of human rights. So if you call this anti-Semitism, you flip it on them and they can't stand it. So they have a very serious investment in fighting the IRA definition.
Exactly. And why did the Durban conference happen? It happened because the previous year, in September of 2000, so this was in August, September of 2001, Arafat rejected peace with Israel at the Camp David conference in July and began his jihad against Israel at the end of September in 2000. So that there was terrorism happening all over the streets of Israel at the time. In fact, the Sparrow bombing, which many of you may remember, that were 15 people, 8 of them children, were murdered in a suicide bombing, that occurred during the Durban conference. So the idea was, okay, we can't say anymore that we're about peace because Arafat already showed that he doesn't want peace. He wants to annihilate Israel. So now that we have to make our support for the Palestinians, who are literally blowing up the streets of Israel and murdering wantonly hundreds of Jewish civilians, children every single day, we have to make it about some other lofty goal. We need a new marketing tool for our anti-Semitism. And so they latched onto human rights. They hijacked the human rights movement and the language of human rights to continue justifying their campaign, their political war against Israel, once the concept of peace was no longer relevant. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but no, that's fine.
I think we can almost show in algebra. How would you pronounce it? Algebraically. Yes. Thanks. That's very fancy.
It's a good word.
We can show that the Palestinians have so turned the language of human rights that now they're basically saying that destroying Israel is a human right.
Right.
It's you can actually show this because they call this the legitimate rights of the Palestinian peoples, among which is the so-called right of return, which is basically
right of
the destruction of Israel. So in the language of rights, and now anti-Semitism has it's like a parasite. Anti-Semitism, like a parasite, has infused the language of human right and has eaten it up from within. And it's become, and all these organizations, people like you and me who follow this closely, I guess you have this cerebral reaction like I do. When you see something that calls itself human rights, the immediate association is that they are racists. They are anti-Semitics.
It's true. It's not cerebral so much as Pavlovian at this point, because we're so, it's like so we don't need it. They've actually destroyed the whole concept of human rights in my mind. They've discredited it completely, which is why when you said Basamayid, a human rights
I noticed,
advocate, I wanted to explain that this is actually true in his case, because there's and so all I wanted to say here, because I want to move on to another a real human rights activist, who is the Iranian American journalist Masih Alinejad, but and the kidnapping plot against her in the United States. But I want to just square the circle. So what happened? So the IRA definition played a very significant role in being able to show the British public that.
Leave that on. Now we know your mom.
Yeah,
I've been waiting to meet your mom.
Everybody want to come see my mom. So we're not gonna edit this out, guys. Now you can all meet my mom, Sharon Glick. Say hi, Mom. Yeah.
Hello, Sharon.
Yeah, okay, this is Gadi. That's okay. So we can look from that and see what they did. So they got screwed, right? All of a sudden, this definition of anti-Semitism is making them discredited, is actually causing them political damage. So what they did was they decided that they were going to do a new definition of anti-Semitism. And in March, they came out with this new definition of anti-Semitism. They called it the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism. Why Jerusalem? Because one of the participants in this was the post-Zionist Van Leer Institute that used to employ Azmi Bishara, who was such a radical member of Knesset that he was actually about to be indicted for spying for Hezbollah in the middle of the war. But because they're in Jerusalem, they called it the Jerusalem Declaration. Two of the initial people who authored this thing this is Moravchik's article, he was writing about this, are actually Jewish supporters of Jeremy Corbyn. All right, there were very few Jewish supporters of Jeremy Corbyn. Most of them, they were Marxist communists, but they were among the people who wrote it. There were about 8 of them. They're all anti-Semites. They write this new thing. Gerald Steinberg from NGO Monitor actually said we should call it the Berlin definition of anti-Semitism, because most of the work on this definition was done in Berlin. So at any rate, this definition puts together, it sort of seems all right. And then it gives not only 5 examples of contemporary anti-Semitism, which sound an awful lot like classical anti-Semitism, racial anti-Semitism, but they also have 5 examples of what is not anti-Semitism. And this is where it's very important, right? Because saying Israel doesn't have a right to exist, so the Jewish people alone in the entire world have no right to self-determination and political freedom. The calling Israel Nazi is not anti-Semitism. Calling Israel apartheid. So everything that the progressives do is fine. So this is now being peddled. It's all being peddled in international circles. Our foreign minister, Yair Lapid, in many ways attached himself to this horrible definition when he gave this execrable speech last week to the Forum on Fighting Global Anti-Semitism, where he said that anti-Semites are slave sellers, slave merchants.
Anyone who is a hater is an anti-Semite. So any form of group hatred is anti-Semitism, he said. Right. And this is, and I try to say this on Facebook and then on the radio in some show that this is exactly the Obama line, because it's the corollary of saying that anti-Semites are all victims of hate are victims of anti-Semitism, and all haters are the same. And this is specifically designed to whitewash. I guess you don't. Whitewash is no longer a useful term in those circles, but it's to whitewash Islamic radicalism, because Obama forbade his administration to say jihadist and Muslim terrorism and replaced this with the general term violent extremism. So
Right.
that when a kosher supermarket was bombed in Paris by a jihadist terrorist, he said that a terrorist extremist murdered some folks.
Folks
That's
at
all.
Delhi. They called.
Yeah,
called
and this is
some folks
and what
in
is the
Delhi.
next step? What is the next step? The next step is if anti-Semitism is any group stereotype that's negative, then if you want to avoid being an anti-Semite, then don't generalize about Muslims. And then if you say that this is an anti-Semitic attack by jihadists, then you suffer from Islamophobia. And it was Andrew McCarthy who said that Islamophobia is not a phobia.
Right.
It is a term invented by the Muslim Brotherhood in order, he said, to discourage any discussion of Sharia supremacist ideology, Sharia being the religious code of the radical Muslims of Islam. And so it's specifically designed to disarm Jews protesting anti-Semitism. This is what it does.
Yep.
It's supposed to shut you up when you try to protest against anti-Semitism. And now our foreign minister, you don't say for Christ's sake.
For crying out loud.
For crying out loud, our foreign minister is cooperating with this. And the Zionist or American Zionist organization sent him a letter of protest saying, what are you doing? These are the tools they are using against us in our fight against anti-Semitism. And he just, because he's completely empty, my theory of him is he's a complete postmodern. So now in all these, this is in front of European foreign ministers. So it's a progressive forum. And he just wanted to get a pat on the head, and he doesn't have a gyroscope, only a radar, so he tries to please whatever audience he talks to. And now you're saying this and it sounds good to you and you think this is idealistic. I don't want to use stronger terms. It's terrible.
It is terrible, and it's also incredibly dangerous to Jews in Israel and in the diaspora, and it leads directly to the accreditation, the giving credibility to actions like Ben & Jerry's, which really just involve dehumanizing Jews. Because nobody knows. I mean, we had to go through this whole explanation of where Judea and Samaria are, what are the occupied territories, because really what he's doing is saying boycott the Israelis who work in Be'er Tuvia, who make this ice cream, deny them a livelihood. Let's close down their shop. It's not let's deny the enjoyment of Ben & Jerry's. There are loads of ice creams that Israelis can choose from. Nobody really cares about Ben & Jerry's. Starbucks came to Israel in the early part of the century, and they totally failed because we have better coffee, and nobody was able to latch onto the idea that you pay $10 for a cup of coffee that tastes like crap. No, for whatever reason, it just didn't work in this country. And I mean, I'm in Chicago, but I'm in Israel. It just didn't work. So Ben & Jerry's, people like it, but this isn't like a big deal to anybody. Nobody cares that much. They're not a big deal here. We're just not that into them. The people who are harmed are the people who produce Ben & Jerry's ice cream in Israel. And he's doing it for feel-good points that he wants to receive from a bunch of anti-Semites, from people who are saying that Israel, the Jewish state, is inherently criminal, like South Africa under the apartheid regime. There's no similarity between the two, but Ben & Jerry's have bought into this idea because it's pleasing to them. And that's why, again, just to round off the circle, Americans who own stock in Unilever should really be protesting to the board of Unilever and saying, look, we're going to divest from the stock. Mutual funds that have money in Unilever, if they're living in the 38 states in the United States that have passed anti-BDS laws, should be calling on their pension funds to divest from Unilever in accordance with the laws in their states, and so on and so forth. I mean, there are things that people can do. Not everybody in the United States, certainly not in the states that have passed anti-BDS laws, who are our allies in fighting anti-Semitism. They should be talking to them about enforcing the law, divesting from Unilever, and Unilever should divest itself. If they want, they can unload Ben and Jerry's if they refuse to cancel the boycott. But these are things that are directed specifically, again, in Israel. No skin off our back. The franchise owner already said that he's thinking about canceling the license that he has, and then he'll just sell his ice cream, whatever it is, under a different label. Nobody cares. This is all, and the people who are being hurt, the people who are being demonized are Israel supporters abroad. And people need to understand that anti-Semitism is a hatred, but it's a unique kind of hate, and it uniquely hates Jews. And trying to universalize it and try to latch on to the intersectionality crap, right? And pretend that, you can't fight anti-Semitism if you don't support BLM is just a way to expand anti-Semitic attacks against Jews. Anti-Semites are not our allies in fighting anti-Semitism. They're our enemies. And the way that you fight anti-Semitism is turning to allies like the evangelical Christians, like so many people of good character in the United States, and working with them to oppose anti-Semitism and isolating the people who support it. You don't empower anti-Semites, and that's a whole insane concept behind embracing the PLO, a terrorist organization, as Israel's peace partner. That was never going to work. They exist to annihilate Israel. If you want to have peace, then you bypass the anti-Semites. You don't empower them. And same thing here. You don't empower anti-Semites if you want to fight it. You undermine them, you discredit them, you delegitimize them, you isolate them, not us. And so that's really, the ABCs of it all. And now we have to turn to real allies in the fight of against anti-Semitism, and those are the Iranian people. This, of course, is something that has barely been covered in the press, either in Israel, because our press is following the example of the propaganda organs of America.
Disgustingly.
And so you don't see it. You have to go online. I follow a lot of Iranian oppositioners on my Twitter feed. You should follow my Twitter feed at Carolyn Glick on Twitter and look there. And then you can, delve into it more directly by following them. But today, unbeknownst to almost anybody really who isn't following it, there are nationwide protests, uprising throughout Iran in the oil-rich province of Khuzestan. They're just lighting up the streets, calling for the overthrow of the regime. They're being, and then the people of Iran in every single province in that country are standing up in solidarity with the Khuzestan workers who are calling for the overthrow of the regime. Women, I got a report today, women in the subways in Tehran, where women are subjected to gender apartheid, and they sit in separate train cars than the men. They're screaming, "Death to Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran." It's all over the country. People are calling for the downfall of Iran. There's another protest where in a different province where people were apologizing to the Shah's heir, to his son, saying, "We're sorry, the biggest mistake we ever made was overthrowing your father. Come back. We want to overthrow the regime." I mean, these are incredibly radical things to say, and all of the tens of hundreds of thousands of Iranians who are saying them in the streets. In Khuzestan, they're being shot point blank by regime officials. They are the most courageous people that we've ever seen, ever. They're amazing, and we have to be supporting them. And nobody is. And I'll just give one example, and then I'll open it up to Gadi. Last week, the Iranian American human rights journalist and human rights activist Masih Alinejad, it was published that the Iranian intelligence services had hatched a plot that they were advancing to kidnap her in her home in Brooklyn, which they were scoping. They had hired a private eye to follow her everywhere, to take high-resolution pictures of her working in her garden with her husband and her children. I mean, crazy stuff. They were planning on abducting her from her home. They were following, by the way, all of her friends and associates in the United States as well, putting her on a Swift boat, a military-grade boat that they were going to purchase, and speared her away to Venezuela, which is allied with the Iranian regime, and from there transfer her to Iran. I don't know if people know, but there are 2 Iranian military flights to Caracas every week. It's been going on for years and years, and there is a lot of talk about the uranium mines in Venezuela and what their role is in developing Iran's nuclear weapons project. So the Biden administration, when this came out that this was happening, and they indicted, the Justice Department indicted 4 Iranians, 3 of whom are unreachable. They're in Iran. They're intelligence officers there. And one is an American Iranian who's an Iranian agent in Los Angeles who were involved in this. They announced the indictments, the Justice Department did, and the State Department and the White House refused to say anything about it. They referred all reporters' questions about the plot to the Justice Department, treated it like a criminal justice issue, would not condemn the Iranian government, the regime, for seeking to carry out terrorism on the streets of the United States, abducting an American citizen, and bringing her to Iran.
But hey, look, Caroline, Khashoggi.
Right, Khashoggi. I saw that he was, again, our brain dead media in Israel. I didn't watch it, but I heard them again rehashing the whole Khashoggi thing, because that's the worst thing in the world, and Saudi Arabia is terrible. And let's go after an Israeli high-tech firm that sells software to intelligence equipment to foreign intelligence things, and say that Israel is responsible for tracking dissidents in Bahrain. Like, we should care, because the dissidents in Bahrain were trying to overthrow the regime in order to transform that country into an Iranian satellite state. But we're supposed to, want them to be able to reign free and overthrow an allied government.
So I'll just say the obvious is that this is the old Obama line. This is what Obama did when there was protest against the regime.
The Green Revolution.
He just turned his back on them, because his whole strategy is about making Iran the centerpiece of a new Middle Eastern order, which would
be fine if it wasn't this regime, right? Because the Shah regime was a strategic ally of both the United States.
But he wouldn't have done it. He wouldn't have done it with the Shah regime,
right?
Because the Shah regime, he's trapped in the progressive Edward Said paradigm, and so the Shah is a CIA creation in that language, right? So that's colonialism,
right.
But the real spirit of Iran is radical Islam, and they keep avoiding the glaring fact that Iran hates America and calls it the big devil.
Right.
They think that appeasing extremists somehow pacifies them, and that has never been true. It's not true anywhere. It's not true with your class bully, and it's not true with world communism, fascism, or any violence and dictatorship in the global. It's not working with China too, right? So it never works, and they keep committing this mistake, which I think is based on narcissism. It's based on narcissism because everything the other feels is somehow what we made them feel. So it's always up to us. They don't respect the fact that these are sophisticated, fanatic, fundamentalist ideologues, and that nothing America does will ever pacify their hate, and that their real dream is to destroy first Israel and then America.
I mean, it's also important to understand the strategic implications, because to a large degree, and understandably, I think, the United States of America has used human rights as a means to an end. Everybody says that they're for human rights, but it's a question of whose, because as LBJ said, yeah, he's an SOB, but he's our SOB, right? So that there if you want to be responsible in advancing your country's interests, you're not necessarily going to push the same human rights agenda against everybody equally, because if you do, you may end up harming your ally. There are really excellent reasons to say that what I just said was immoral and horrible, and you can't say that, and you have to fight human rights everywhere. And if you were really going to fight for human rights everywhere in a serious way, without prejudice, then I would say, you're absolutely right. If you're capable of actually across the board advancing a serious human rights agenda, but also requiring people to have the means in place to if you bring down a regime, actually replace it with something better. That kind of agenda is incredibly serious, and you have to be very responsible when you use it. But that's not how anything ever works, right? But here, the strategic implications of standing with the Iranian people against this regime are all positive. There's no downside to overthrowing this regime. There's no downside to standing in solidarity, so that even the realists, so-called, the Americans who don't want to enter, or the American first people, Trump supporters who got tired of the whole messianic concept of democratizing the world that the neoconservatives put forward as a reason for invading Iraq in 2003. Iraqi freedom. That's the point of the war. No, the war was actually to fight terrorism in Iraq. And so you can say, all right, you can be opposed to democratizing the world, to saving everybody on the planet, and still want to ardently support the Iranian people, because overthrowing this regime is going to massively advance American national security interests, and of course Israeli and regional national security or international security. It's going to end the most dangerous threat to the nuclear non-proliferation regime since the dawn of the atomic age in 1945, because if Iran gets the bomb, then everybody's going to pursue it, and we're going to have a nightmare on our hands in the Middle East. And also because Iran, what are you going to do? They want to annihilate the Jewish state. They want to kill all the Jews, and they want to annihilate the United States, and they're developing ICBMs in alliance with North Korea. So if all of these threats will be diminished, if not as a practical matter, eliminated, if this regime goes. There's no possible reason for the Biden administration not to be supporting the Iranian people, and yet they're not. Tony Blinken finally spoke with Masih Alinejad today, and he puts out this tweet. He says, "We support journalistic freedom everywhere." He didn't mention Iran in it. He didn't say anything against Iran. He didn't say the Iranian regime was trying to conduct a terrorist organization. So the last thing I want to just say real quick, because we do want to turn it over to Gadi. Can you just really briefly, before you have to leave, before we have to end this, can we just hear what happened with your article in Haaretz, so that our readers understand that not only are you a celebrity, but you're doing God's work by writing for an anti-Semitic paper?
Yeah, I'll say just a word, and I think it's worth discussing the whole thing in more detail next time. But I basically said the obvious. I said that the whole narrative about that removed Netanyahu from office, the narrative about Netanyahu being corrupt, which hurt him electorally, seriously hurt him, is based on something so ridiculous in terms of the criminal law that the attorney general is not able to explain in court what exactly the crime was. And of course, since the whole narrative of the left is built on this, what I did is, I touched the Holy Grail, or I don't know, the radioactive center of all this and everything. Yeah. And everyone wanted to shut me up. These people were seriously arguing that Haaretz should not let me write about the topic. Why? Because I'm not a lawyer. And this is the most ridiculous argument I've heard, because Haaretz is full of people writing on this who are not lawyers. And the press is all full of people writing about this who are not lawyers. And it's okay so long as they toe the party line. If you don't, all hell breaks loose. And I love this because it draws attention to your argument. So you need, whenever you want to do this, don't do a half measure. If you want to stick a finger in the eye, stick it deeply and turn it, because then they scream bloody murder and they want to shut you up, and then everybody goes to read your article saying let's see what they even translated it to English. So if you want to look it up in Haaretz, you can.
And I hope it's not behind the paywall. If it is, then, we'll just summarize. He said, Netanyahu is now standing on trial. The trial opened with the bribery charge against him, which is the only serious charge that he's being accused of. They're trying to make their point. They're trying to make their case. They have no evidence. Now, they were never asked by the media, by all the legal experts who aren't lawyers or whatever in the Israeli media for the past few years to make their case. Unfortunately, as you wrote, in a court, you actually need to produce evidence, and it works that they don't have any. There's no evidence that either a bribe was given or that a bribe was taken. And so this whole thing that, again, brought about the electoral downfall of Benjamin Netanyahu by peeling away just enough and discrediting him and legitimized hating him as the major motif in Israeli politics for the past 4 elections, the past 2 years, all of this is based on a complete lie. More next time, guys. It was great seeing you again. Our show, again, is on Rumble. It's on YouTube. It's on numerous podcasts that you can download. All of the links are on my site. And also, there's a subscription button. Subscribe to our updates. Subscribe to my updates. Join the thousands of people who receive all of my work and the Carolyn Glick Middle East News Hour every week. I promise I don't bother you. I only send it out like once and maximum twice a week. So come join us, be part of the show, ask us questions. And if we have time, we're going to answer them. We'll talk about the topics that are important to you. And we hope that the topics that are important to us are important to you as well. So have a great day. Have a great week. And we'll see you again next week. Take care.
See you. Enjoy Chicago, Carolyn.
Thanks so much. You already met my mom. How could I not be happy?
Yeah. That was a first.
Yeah, right? Okay, bye-bye.
Good night.